By now, you've either seen Bill Nye's Netflix program, Bill Nye Saves the World, or you've heard of it. Having heard a lot of bad things about it myself, I decided to give episode 9, The Sexual Spectrum, a watch Friday night. It wasn't as bad as I'd heard it was. It was worse. Much worse. It is unbelievably, profoundly cringe-worthy. And it is difficult to resist the temptation to simply mock it. Indeed, plenty of great work has already been done in mockery of it. However, as eminently mockable as the presentation is, one might believe that the arguments presented therein are sound. Indeed, one finds Nyophiles who claim exactly that. For example, but he also demonstrated a nuanced understanding and surprising willingness to embrace the idea that a biological-centered binary is not the end-all, be-all of human existence, at pajiba.com. Today, I will show that Mr. Nye's program has no such redeeming qualities. The program proceeds in several acts, including a gender spectrum abacus and a floating clownfish, a gushing segment on androgynous K-pop musicians, a panel of experts, including a comedian, a gender studies theorist, and a cultural anthropologist, but no biologist, an ice cream orgy, and a vagina song. Each of these comes with its own attached argument or set of attached arguments to tell the following story. Sexuality is on a spectrum, including whatever biological element is involved. And this biological element is conceptually distinct from gender. In fact, gender is a social construction, and all deviations from binary notions of sex, gender, and attraction are perfectly natural. Only stodgy, oppressive personalities who arbitrarily embrace binary notions to uphold Bronze Age ideas against real science oppose all of this. Besides, you have a right to do whatever you want. You should believe what we're telling you, because it increases the varieties of hot, sexy sex you can have. Rather than argue against each part of this story, my criticism aims at the bad arguments underlying it. Namely, Mr. Nye's arguments that all things sexual lie on a spectrum. Having shown that Mr. Nye has not made his case, I will demonstrate that he has not really offered a biological explanation of sex and sexuality at all. Mr. Nye explicates the spectrum idea by dividing sexuality into 4 independent categories: sex, by which he means biological sex, male and female, gender, attraction, and expression. Each of these, we are told, exists on a spectrum, with such evidence as not everyone or everything fits into the categories of male or female. Corollaries include not everyone identifying with the gender ordinarily associated with that person's biological sex, not everyone being heterosexual, and the fact that some people vary with respect to gender expression, even to the point of some transgressing their culture's gender norms. All of this appears to fit the following argument. For any set of categories, if it is the case that some token exists that does not fit into a category comprising that set, then these categories are unreal, that is, unscientific, naming poles on a spectrum instead. There are people who do not fit the traditional binary categories surrounding sex, gender, attraction, and expression. Therefore, those categories are unreal, that is, unscientific, naming poles on a spectrum instead. The argument as rendered is deductively valid, but that's a low bar. We need to know whether it's sound, that is, whether the argument is valid and the premises are true. They aren't. Mr. Nye himself tips us off to why the first premise is false by alluding to categories we have yet to identify. This is quite different from saying that sex, gender, attraction, and expression are on their own spectra. After all, if I say that all marbles are made of iron, I claim that any token marble will fit into the category of things that are both marbles and iron. If I encounter a glass marble, I've got some options. It may be that marbles fall onto a spectrum between the poles of being fully iron and fully glass. Or that rather than falling on a spectrum, there's just another category of marbles. There are entities for which the non-spectrum conclusion is especially apt. Given what else we know about science, physics and chemistry in this case, we cannot understand marble matter as falling on a spectrum partway between silica and iron as described on the periodic table. Any change in the number of protons in an atom's nucleus radically changes its chemical properties, rendering it of a new kind, that is, a different element. Given what science tells us now, there is no element we could discover that would produce a spectrum view of the elements on the periodic table. Elements are just not that kind of thing. An atom is an iron atom, or it isn't. Period. Thus, the first premise is false because there are cases in which the discovery of a new token that does not fit an existing category does not warrant the conclusion that those categories are really poles on a spectrum or are unscientific. We can go even further. Consider the following statement. All squirrels have 4 legs. It seems that Mr. Nye would have us believe that finding a 3-legged squirrel would prove this sentence is false. After all, this is what he is asking us to believe about all human beings are male or female on the basis of non-standard combinations of sex chromosomes. That is, those falling outside the usual female XX and male XY. After all, you can wind up with XXY, X, XXX, XYY, and so on. And not all of these produce very noticeable differences in secondary sex characteristics, by the way. However, finding a 3-legged squirrel does not invalidate all squirrels have 4 legs. That sentence is telling us something about what it is to be a fine squirrel specimen. It is not telling us about the actual variety we see. In fact, the sentence is telling us something about why a 3-legged squirrel is disadvantaged. The 3-legged squirrel will have some trouble living out the life cycle characteristic of its species. Sentences like, all squirrels have 4 legs, are what philosopher Philippa Foot calls Aristotelian categoricals. These are sentences that tell us how a kind of plant or animal, considered at a particular time and in its natural habitat, develops, sustains itself, defends itself, and reproduces. In other words, an Aristotelian categorical tells us about a species' mode of life at a particular time in its evolutionary development. Aristotelian categoricals are incredibly useful, and the existence of non-standard forms is not enough to upset them. But that is all that Nye gives us. We are now ready to see why the clownfish example is inapt. Clownfish are born male with one breeding pair within the group. If the female in that pair disappears, the male of the pair will change into a female, and one of the smaller males will take over as the sexually mature male. This is called sequential hermaphroditism. Some organisms possess both male and female reproductive organs at the same time, like many flowering plants. However, dioecious trees only produce male flowers, or female flowers as the case may be. Sea turtle sex is determined by incubation temperature, and so on. In nature, there's a lot of variety. All of this tells us exactly nothing about human sexuality. It tells us nothing scientifically about how it proceeds. Given an arguable evolutionary trend toward sexual dimorphism, even those hermaphroditic clownfish move from one pole to the other, one is at least as entitled to the philosophical claim that something like gender undergirds nature metaphysically as one is entitled to the unreality of a sexual binary. The K-pop part of the program, following androgynous South Korean performer Amber, is intended to make the following point. Gender expression is highly variable. This gains force from the commonplace that some men are more masculine and some women more feminine than others. From this, we are meant to derive 2. Gender is a mere cultural product, a social construction, and 3. Cultural norms of gender expression are arbitrary and oppressive. It is true that there are gender norms out there that are oppressive. However, there are some problems with the chain of inference here, since it is driven by the idea that variability in attitudes or beliefs about something means that there is no fact of the matter regarding that thing. In this case, gender, and better or worse ways of expressing it. The inference is invalid. You might as well say that since some people think the world is flat, there is no fact of the matter, or that we shouldn't teach that the world is an oblate spheroid in school because the belief is arbitrary and oppressive given the disagreement. Our scientific model of the earth is a cultural product, but it is not merely that. I think most people will have an intuitive grasp of why this is, so I won't push the matter. Similarly, the fact that gender expression is variable across cultures, though one wonders just how variable it really is across stable, threat-resistant civilizations, does not show that it is merely a cultural product and therefore arbitrary. My point is that there are social constructions, cultural products, that are grounded in reality. If you think slavery is actually wrong, then this extends to values and interpersonal ideals of the self, which is what gender norms are about. I'll have more to say about this in future videos, probably in future videos on gender. At any rate, cultural variation does not prove that all answers are equally good. To jump out and say that gender is merely a social construction and arbitrary just because expression varies is to posit a conclusion that is either hopelessly underdetermined by the evidence or worse, that begs the question. Pointing to a cultural anthropologist's catalog of variety does not settle a matter that is actually the subject of philosophical anthropology and the metaphysical and moral argumentation doing that entails. This brings us to the panel discussion, Ice Cream Orgy and Vagina Song. Neither gives us much in the way of any scientific exposition. The anthropologist, though, is right to point out that homosexuality as an identity is a relatively recent innovation. It is also unclear what, if any, biological basis there is. However, to conclude, as Mr. Nye does, via Rachel Bloom's pansexual ditty, "Sex how you want, it's your goddamned right," is a non sequitur for the ages. The gender and sexuality studies professor jumps in with there being no definition of the person. Indeed, describing personhood, especially human personhood, is among philosophy's perennial problems. However, that is not to say that traditional philosophy has nothing useful to say on the matter. The panel and Bloom's song conclude that we ought to do what feels right. In light of the previous zoo of ambiguity and confusion, this can amount to no more than the science of feelings the vanilla ice cream cone is mocked for before entering the ice cream orgy. Bloom sings, "It's evolution, ain't nothing new. There's nothing taboo about a sex stew." One wonders what evolution has to do with any of the preceding discussion, or why the mere fact that a thing is desired would morally recommend it. After all, people desire to rape, torture, and worst of all, organize societies around gender norms rooted in the kind of human sexual dimorphism you read about in biology textbooks. But this program is pretty thin on biological, that is, scientific explanations anyway, which is odd for what is presumably a science show. I suspect that the way of thinking Mr. Nye is pushing here is seductive because there is a lot to human relationships that goes beyond biological function. This is so even on a conservative view of sexuality narrowly focused on marriage. However, the biological function of sex is the most obvious place for biology to start. The human reproductive system has a biological function. That function is to produce offspring. This brings us back to those Aristotelian categoricals, statements that tell us about a species' mode of life and flourishing at a particular time in its evolutionary development. As philosophers would say, sex has a certain teleology. That is, a function, a point. Indeed, the idea that form fits function was a constant refrain as I earned my undergraduate degree in biology. You just can't understand very much about biological systems without bringing it up. Consider that there are many phenomena in which the heart plays a role as an efficient cause. An efficient cause is the sort of cause we're talking about when we talk about particles bumping into other particles. The heart makes sounds. It pumps blood. It consumes oxygen and nutrients from the blood, and it expels waste into the blood. You can even feel pulses in your wrists and neck. These facts alone tell you little about the heart. To understand the significance of these causes and effects, you need to know something about the heart's teleology, what hearts are for. The same is true of our scientific, that is, our biological understanding of human sex and sexuality. For human beings, only coital intercourse between a man and a woman can achieve the biological purpose of sex and sexual desire. XX and XY chromosomal pairs can produce properly functioning females and males. That is, females and males whose organs are ordered to successful sexual reproduction, given our species' mode of life. At the least, XXX, X, XXY, XYY, and other individuals do not count against the Aristotelian categoricals, nor do intersex persons whose sexual organs developed in non-standard ways in utero, those who are unreceptive to sex hormones, and so on. In fact, It is because of the Aristotelian categoricals and teleology that we can talk about intersex conditions as disorders of sexual development, which is how many intersex persons themselves prefer to be described. My point is that talking about function and form is critical to offering a biological, that is, scientific, explanation of human sex and sexuality. That is exactly what Mr. Nye fails to give us. There are a lot of philosophical issues that get raised when we bring up Aristotelian categoricals and teleology. Teleology might be an artifact of our minds we use to understand things, or it may be real, a rational order underlying nature that our minds discover. The second way of going about teleology has moral consequences without reducing morality to biology and desire. That moral tradition also preserves the dignity of those who fall outside the biological norms of sexual development, attraction, and so on, because it says something concrete about what human animals are as human persons. Mr. Nye, in fact, appears to reduce morality to biology and desire. After all, he endorses the idea that the ethics of sex are settled by a dubiously argued spectrum, and the fact that one desires to act or express in a particular way. It is unclear how anything could have any self-transcending significance on this view. In a way, the ice cream example is apt, since on the worldview Nye appears to be pushing, our attitudes towards sex, sexuality, sexual identity, and so on are no more significant than one's favorite flavor of ice cream. That is itself deeply nihilistic and profoundly alienating. If this video resonated with you, raised questions, or otherwise made you think, comment, click like, and subscribe. If you think I missed something or if you hated it, feel free to explain in the comments.